the Starlight Lounge presents An Evening with the Progressive Box.
Old moon, yeah. That's Hugo, tickling the ivories. He just saved by bundling home and auto with Progressive. Gonna finally buy a ring for that gal of yours, Hugo? Send her my condolences. Hi-oh! This next one's for you two. There's a burglar in my heart. Thank you.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Discounts not available in all states or situations.
Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family. Talk about adoption and infertility. Today, we're going to be talking about the impact of loss on foster kids and on foster parents. It's an important topic. We all know it. We all know that loss is a big portion of what children face and also what sometimes parents face, foster parents face. Good topic, good guest. Here's a sample of what you're going to hear.
It's important to not look at this in a dichotomy. Even when there's abuse or neglect, there can also be moments of connection and celebration and happy things. You know, it's not necessarily all one or the other. And even if it is more negative, you know, as I just said, there's still that connection, that familiarity.
This show is brought to you by Creating a Family. We are the national adoption and infertility and fostering education and support nonprofit. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am your host and the director of Creating a Family. You can find us and all of our resources online at creatingafamily.org. This show is underwritten by our corporate sponsor, not our corporate, by our foundation sponsor, Jockey Being Family Foundation. Their mission is that every child deserves to grow up in a loving home and a forever home. They are a wonderful organization, and they've got big news because they've got a large gala coming up. It is their major fundraiser of the year. It's March 20th and 21st. It's a gala and golf classic. I tend to forget the golf part because I really focus more on the gala part, but it is both, and it is in the Grand Geneva Resort area and Spa, which is near Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is honestly just north of Chicago. So if you are in that general area, it is a hop, skip, and a jump for you. You can support this wonderful organization who is a big supporter of this show, that is the Jockey Being Family Foundation. And you can also have a grand time at both the gala and at the golf tournament. So who knows, you may even win something at golf. So I'm not even sure if there are going to be prizes, but every golf tournament I know about has prizes. So consider it, guys. Pop on over there. You can get more information at their website. And by the way, it's a new website, so check it out, jockeybeingfamily.com. Today we're talking about the impact of loss on both foster kids and foster parents with Karen Buckwalter. She is the Director of Program Strategies at Chaddock, and Chaddock is a foster care agency, and they also have a trauma and attachment center. And Karen is the author of Attachment Theory in Action, Building Connections Between Children and Parents. Karen, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this, as I said, a really important topic. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
You know, loss just feels inherent in foster care. I mean, a child is the obvious loss is the loss of family. A child is removed very often suddenly from their home. So certainly loss of their parent or parents or parent is a big and very obvious loss. But I think there's so many other losses that children face when they enter foster care. So let's talk about some of the other losses, just to kind of give a more full circle to the depth of loss that is associated with entering foster care for most children.
Yes, you bring up a very important point that, you know, there's that obvious overriding loss that would be in everyone's minds, although we'll talk later about sometimes that's hard to talk about, but also the less obvious ones, you know, it could be loss of culture. Perhaps your family of origin is a Hispanic family, and you're going to a family of a white family or another race family. So there's that loss of culture. I think tied in with that are people that look like you. I think people really underestimate what it means when someone says to a child, "Oh, you have your eyes," or "Oh, look at you. You stand just like your mommy." Those are just little passing comments, and we don't think much about them when we say them to biological children. But sometimes for children who look different, they're not hearing those kinds of comments that, allow them to feel connected. And then, of course, there's the medical history, depending how connected they're going to be remaining with their family. I think sometimes, baby pictures, childhood mementos get lost in the shuffle. And another one I think people really don't think about is birth order. There's whole books about being a youngest, being an oldest, being a middle child. But in foster care, you could be an oldest and suddenly now you're a youngest in one home. Yeah. And maybe you're a middle child in the next home. I think, faith tradition, maybe your family's Methodist and you go to a Baptist family or a family where faith isn't even a part of their life. So I just think, some of those things we often overlook and don't think about as carefully as maybe would be helpful.
Yeah, and one of the it comes back to you talked about loss of birth order. Another loss is the loss of your role in the family, and we got an interesting question from Brenda. Excuse me on that. She says, "My foster daughter is really suffering. In some ways, I think the biggest loss for her is her role as a mother figure in her younger brother's life. We are fostering both kids. We have insisted that we are the parents and she can relax into just being a kid and not always in charge and responsible for her brother. Her brother has accepted this really well, but she is fighting us on it. I wonder if it would be better to allow her to share this role because it seems so hard for her." And I think Brenda brings up such a good point that parentification is a term that is sometimes used. Older children in families, particularly families where there has been neglect, have very often stepped into a parental role. So let's talk some about that.
That is such an important question. And I think the answer is going to be a both and. I think that we don't want to continue having that role for the child, a child that's had to be overly responsible, a child that has had to worry all the time about adult kinds of problems, that sort of thing. So I wouldn't recommend, let's let her do some of that. I think the parents are on the right track with saying, we're the adults, we'll take care of things. But the both and piece is to really be honoring that child's experience, how hard that must be for you, saying things like this, that you were so used to taking care of your little brother. I mean, I wonder if sometimes you just feel like, how could I trust somebody else to do that? Or maybe you feel a little empty inside or not sure how to handle this. So I think there's a way to go about not continuing that idea that she has to be the parent because, we don't want that, of course. But at the same time, recognizing the difficulty of that for the child, and that it is a loss for the child, a loss of a role, whether it was a functional or a dysfunctional role. It was something that the child was accustomed to. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then we do make an attempt very often to keep siblings together, but sadly, that is not always possible, particularly in larger sibling groups or when one of the children has a significant need. So obviously, I guess the the other side to this is a loss of siblings is certainly a possibility, as well as a loss of grandparents, aunts, uncles, extended family. So all of those are real. Let's talk about the loss of school. Sadly, children are not always able to continue in the school that they have gone to. And so loss of school also means loss of friends, and both in school and in their community. And depending on the age of the child, that can be huge.
Absolutely. And also the loss of a teacher. We know that sometimes, teachers are, elementary classrooms where they may have the same child all day, are sometimes with our children more than parents are able to be with their children. And
true.
so I think that loss of that teacher, those peer relationships, that familiar feeling of going to your school, knowing the routine of your school is so important to be thinking about, and how can we acknowledge that that's hard. I think, Dawn, so much of what we're talking about here is validating and acknowledging how hard that must be, and opening space for the child to express that, while at the same time then supporting the new school. How can you get involved to maybe help facilitate some friendships and let teachers know, without sharing too much private information, why your child may need some extra support and extra attention in a transition like this. So I think that you bring up such a good point with the school situation.
Yeah, and we're going to circle that we're going to be moving directly into talking about what foster parents can do to help with loss. But before we do, there's one loss that I bring up because I have seen a number of cases where this was felt so intensely by the child, and that is loss of pets. They oftentimes have, as all children do, attached to their animals, and I don't know whether this could just be an easy way that this loss is manifesting itself as the greatest one in these cases, because it's covering up for other losses. But children can feel intensely the pain of leaving a dog or a cat or other pet behind.
Yes, that's so true. I think that, animals and our pets love us unconditionally, and they're always happy to see you, and, wanting to cuddle with you. Even cats may sometimes not be as social as dogs, but still you have that cat wanting to rub up against your leg or hop up in your lap, and that feeling, that unconditional love that they feel, that can be a real force of almost stability in knowing how that animal is going to react to them, that may be missing in some other areas of their life.
Absolutely, yeah. And it can be expressed very intensely, and maybe perhaps because it's a safe way to express a deep loss. To be missing a pet, it feels safer. So let's talk about how children express loss at different developmental stages, and keeping in mind that chronological age may or may not be reflective, particularly in children in foster care. Chronological age may not reflect their developmental stage. So let's start with very young children, infants who are removed from a familiar environment. How might an infant act? How might an infant express loss?
Well, I think that you may see changes in eating patterns. So maybe when the child came to you, you understood that, this might be the feeding schedule or what was going on with the child, and suddenly this child's not wanting to eat, or is seeming to have trouble sleeping at night when that wasn't recorded before. And I think, in foster care, it's it's very hard to tease out, what's related to trauma, what's related to grief, what's related to something else. But I think with our little ones, and even many of our older ones, it's these behaviors that are showing, this is having an impact on me, this is difficult for me. They're not being able to give you those words. And I think, some of those tried and true things that we talk about, having routines, having structure, having predictability, all of those kinds of things that we often talk about with parenting in general become a very important aspect of this to create a feeling of safety and connection as that children deal with feelings of loss.
Yeah, some of the behaviors we might see are excessive crying or a lack of crying. Just child withdrawing. Both can be reflective and changing in appetite and our eating patterns and sleeping patterns. What about one of the things that I think most foster parents have an instinct to do, and that is to, as soon as a child comes, to immediately put the child in fresh, clean clothes and wash the clothes that the child has been in. But what about the sense of smell? And as far as being able, familiar smells being comforting to a child in that first short period of time, or the first time when the child is in your home.
Yes, I think that's true, that we that olfactory sense, that sense of smell, we know can be so strong. I mean, even as adults, you can get a scent of something and it takes you right back to a certain experience. So I think that it's not always a good idea to, I'm not saying you should leave them in the same clothes for a week or something, but I think having some of those things around. I've had success sometimes with children sleeping, with a familiar piece of clothes or a stuffed animal or something that they brought with them for the exact, some people think maybe it's so they could cuddle with this. I think often it could be the exact thing that you're talking about, that there's that scent or that piece of familiarity that feels comforting and familiar to them.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the crying,
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm so glad that you mentioned the crying, and that it can be excessive crying or not crying at all. I think people don't realize that babies can be depressed, and not crying is not necessarily a good thing. It could mean that they're just shut down. I think we have an idea with babies that when they're fussy, they're crying, and if they're quiet, then all is good. And so I think it's very important that you point out that's not necessarily so. It could be, but you need to look at that maybe more carefully, that you're not having crying and that the baby's kind of withdrawn and sad and depressed.
So on what parents can do to help this age group, but foster parents when they get a new child, 2 and under, or infant, let's say, some of the things that a parent can do, we just talked about. One, which is don't automatically remove all the familiar smells from the child. Even if you think that the shirt that they came in is grody looking, you can either, if not have the child continue to wear it, allow the child to carry it or sleep with it or something along that. So that's certainly one thing. What about the responding to the child's needs? I think we oftentimes have this concern that we're setting up a bad habit. The child is, let's say, crying and wants to be held constantly, and you're thinking, good heavens, I'm never going to get anything done. What about the issue of promptly and quickly responding to the child's needs and not worrying about setting up bad habits?
Well, I think that is something that is a misunderstanding, in that the more secure and safe this child feels with you, the more independent they're going to become. And so the way we do that, especially in a situation that we're describing, we want you to hold them a lot, more than you would a child that's been with you a longer period of time, or a birth child even. And so even I would say, rather than decreasing some of that, because you don't want to build a bad habit, increase that even to being able to wear the baby in a front pack or backpack, really being there to calm the baby with rocking and holding and swaying and these kinds of things that are very soothing for children. Having some music can also be something good. I mentioned, as did you, the issues with feeding, and so sometimes feeding should, rather than taking place in the kitchen with everything that can feel a little chaotic, maybe there can be certain times where feeding can take place in a more quiet way with less distractions around them. So that is going to pay off in the long run in the child being less needy as you move on to the future by securing up that connection and being available for that child experiencing such tremendous loss at the beginning. So you got to kind of front load it, is what I'm saying. And if you don't do it that way, and if you're like you said, a very common thought, I don't want to spoil them, I don't want them to be clingy, generally those behaviors are going to last even longer instead of diminish if you take the approach of not meeting them, especially with children this young. But I think with all ages of children making such a huge transition like this.
All right, now let's move up the age and developmental stages to the preschool.
Yeah.
The preschool age. Okay, so some of the things that, in many ways, this is really difficult, the toddler and early preschool years, because the children have no idea what's happening. You know, they don't understand cause and effect, and they don't understand permanence. All they know is that everything in their life has been turned upside down. And they don't have the reasoning skills to understand any of the causes that may have resulted in this. So, what are some of the behaviors we might see that could be a manifestation of loss and grief?
Well, I think that you may see regression in some developmental milestones that have been reached. So that could be maybe they're wetting their bed, or they're having problems with elimination issues, or again, same with the babies, there could be problems with eating and sleeping patterns as the child's waking up, at this age had been sleeping soundly for the night and is now waking up, multiple times a night. I think irritability can be another thing that you might see here, and if there are other children in the home not getting along so well, and that kind of thing. And I think they may also have a lot of questions, and maybe asking the same questions over and over, depending on the child. So I think all of that could be going on at that preschool age.
And another thing that we sometimes see is a child becoming overly controlling. They've lost control for everything, so a fairly logical thing to try to do is gain control. And when a child this age tries to gain control, it's usually it looks ridiculous to us adults. They become stubborn. They say no to everything, which is already something that's developmentally appropriate. But can become even more. A child could be digging their heels in even more as a way of trying to set back some order into what feels like a very disordered life. Yes, I think that's true. And like you said, we talk about this age as children wanting to gain control to begin with, as just a normal part of development, and then having that increase to a level that is taxing on the parent, wanting to control everything, and really having difficulty following any direction, or following any parent authority about different things. I think parents can sometimes feel, I'm being challenged at every little step. If I say blue, the sky's blue, she says it's green, or if I say we're going to go outside and play, then now is the time when he wants to stay inside. It's the time he wants to go outside. So I think that is definitely something that can be a challenge, and the importance of understanding the way you described it, that the child's not just trying to be oppositional or disobedient or something like this, but
is seeking control in a very out of control from their perspective situation, and being able to frame it like that, I think is important for parents to be able to have some more patience and empathy for that, because that's not fun for the parent.
It isn't fun, but it's important for us parents to realize it's not fun for the child either, and to not take their behavior personally, but to recognize it for what it is, which is a symptom of loss and grief.
Yes.
So let's talk about what parents for these younger toddler, preschool, up to 4 and 5. What are some things you've already mentioned? Routines. I am such a believer in routines, even if it's a different routine that the child is used to. What kids so desperately need when they feel totally out of control and they feel like their world is out of control is predictability. So understanding that, all right, we're going to have, we're going to get up at a certain time. We're going to make a bed. We're going to brush our teeth. Then we're going to eat, and then so that everything is it's predictable. So that then we get in the car. Then we put on our seatbelt. Then we go to school. So our daycare. So giving the child some predictability, so that they feel like they can anticipate what's happening. We've talked about that. What are some other things that parents can do for this age group to help the child cope with the grief and loss associated with foster care?
Well, again, I think the nurturing and the extra nurturing, I sometimes call it proacturing, in that maybe you're taking care of this preschooler the way you think that you would take care of a baby, that they need that much nurturance from you and need to be held more and rocked more than a typically developing child would need at this age, because of the impact of the grief and the loss and the sudden changes for them. I think they need honest answers to their questions. As I said, the questions may feel like you've answered the same question 4 or 5 times, but not going into too much detail. We have to remember they don't need a long, drawn-out explanation about this, but just answering their questions, whether it be about, when a visit is happening or something like this. I think sometimes parents think maybe I should just not talk about, any of this and what's going on with it, because I don't want to burden the child with it. But I think giving age-appropriate information about what is going on with this transition and what is going on, what are some of the things that are going to be happening, and if they are going to have contact with the family, letting them know some of that. Again, not extensive, not too much detail, but some basic facts that they can have, I think, is also important. So just honest interactions about some of these questions they might be asking.
Another one would be, don't take the child's behavior personally, even if it's being directed at you. It is not personal. Develop your empathy for what this child is going through. And don't overreact. I see people, it tends to come up in the, particularly in a child who has regressed, a 4-year-old who had been potty trained and is now soiling themselves, are wetting the bed every night. And there is, and I know, I've been there, I truly know and feel the frustration of just one more bed sheet to wash, or, having to change clothes yet again, during the day. I get it. I do. But to understand that this is not a child misbehaving. This is a child who's behaving in the only way they know how, and to not give it more attention than is necessary, to simply change the clothes, change the sheets, and to have faith that as the child feels more secure, that some of these behaviors, particularly if the child had already been toilet trained or day or nighttime, that the child will then go back to where they were when they feel more secure. It just feels that's awfully important to keep that in mind and put it in perspective.
Yes. And, you had mentioned earlier, the clothes, and I mentioned the stuffed animal. Transitional objects, that's what we would talk about sometimes in the world of therapists that something that they're holding with them from before can also be important for this age child too.
Yeah. So now let's move up to the elementary age, say 6 to 11, before we get to the tween years. Let's talk about what are some of the symptoms of loss and grief for this age child?
I think that these children are sometimes a little more apt to act like nothing's happened or act like they're fine, but then their behavior kind of falls apart. And they're maybe really overreacting to something and becoming very, very angry at something that you would not expect that kind of over-the-top reaction to. They may be becoming more argumentative. I think, something we haven't spoken about yet that's wrapped in with this is guilt. Is this my fault? Is it my fault that I can't be with my family? What is this, because I'm a bad kid? So I think a lot of those kinds of things can be coming up for this age child. Oh,
that is I'm so glad you raised that. It particularly comes up if the child had told someone and something was happening, and that was why the child was removed, or a situation where the child was seen going out getting food, going through the garbage and getting food, and the child feels like had they not been caught, this wouldn't have happened, or had they not told the teacher what was happening, or if they had not acted hungry, or if they had cleaned themselves up more, or if only they had done X, this would not have happened. And that's particularly prone to older kiddos. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so I think that's something to be very aware of, and I think the word that comes to mind is confusion, but I think what I would say is kids will make up in their own minds, in their own ways, what's going on if they don't get enough information from us. And so that's why, earlier we were discussing, giving some age-appropriate amounts of information to children. It's not like if you don't say anything, then they're just not going to wonder about it. Instead, some of these kind of things that we're talking about can be rolling around in their mind. Exactly what you described, that I'm somehow responsible and this kind of thing. And so I think, sharing appropriate facts to help with that.
Yeah. What about how loss and grief can be expressed in the school environment?
I think that you can see grades lowering for sure. I think you can see just a change in demeanor of a child. Maybe a child seemed to be much more of an extrovert and now seems very introverted and withdrawn. I think some of the behaviors that can be problematic at home, maybe snapping at a sibling or something like this, you could possibly see in some peer relationships where that was a good buddy or a good friend for the child if they're in their same school. If they're in a new school, we talked about how in addition to the strain of academics and all of that, they're dealing with this transition of losing all their friends and those kinds of things. So I think it's a lot for them to be dealing with all at one time, for sure.
It is. It just breaks my heart as we talk about, and the worry. Just think about from a child, particularly this age child, who's old enough to worry. They love their parents. They are worried. What's happening to my parent? What are they going through? Who's taking care of great grandpa? Who's feeding the dog? Just worry. They don't know what's happening to the people they love and the environment they love, and it just breaks your heart if you think about how hard this must be and all the compounding factors that just piled on one after the other.
Well, and this can even be life or death. Many children today are being removed due to drug abuse and addiction in parents. And, at the same time, you're seeing on the news and on billboards and all kinds of things about, it was meth for a while, but now it's heroin and people overdosing and dying. So there's going to be a lot of triggers in the environment that are going to remind the child, even in moments where when maybe they're doing better at managing this, that are going to trigger feelings of upset. Is my parent safe? Are they alive?
Yeah.
Are they okay?
Yeah. Are they alive?
So,
yeah. At least when I was there, I would see them. They might be stoned out of their mind, but I would see that they were alive, a couple of times a week, and now I don't have that reassurance. Exactly. Let's talk about food hoarding, which is not necessarily, it can be, of course, but it's not necessarily exclusively associated with loss. But children who have had food insecurities, that adds to their worry, and there is, from their standpoint, a very logical response to that is to hide food, hoard food, overeat, sneak food, all of these food-related issues are not at all atypical in this or in older kids, the older kids as well, tweens and teens, but certainly in this age group. It's not necessarily a direct reflection of grief or loss, but it is certainly a reflection of insecurity. So how should parents respond?
My recommendation on that, and not every person that you would ask an opinion about this is going to give the same as I am, but I think making food available at all times. I think that if there's some appropriate snacks that a child can even have in their bedroom that are going to be messy and sticky or whatever, I think having a little snack in their backpack or somehow on their person, I think is important. And I think you can have these be more healthy choices and things like this. I'm not saying it has to be sugar and candy and things like that, but I think having food available all of the time is what is going to make them get beyond that, and not shaming them if you do find a bunch of wrappers or things like this where even though you've tried to make food available to them, they somehow got into something else. And understanding that is a symptom of pain, and like you just mentioned, and that it's a symptom of having to potentially have had to live without food in certain circumstances, or not knowing when you're going to have food. It can also, this gets back to that comment I made earlier about proactive nurture. I think food is a way children who've lacked nurturance find that they can soothe themselves. And so I think becoming even more nurturing with children who may be seeking to soothe themselves through food at the same time that you're also having that food available. Now, if it's really excessive, like I wouldn't, I've heard actually binging every night at dinner on massive amounts of food. Now that's different, and I would not recommend allowing that. And I think a parent needs to set limits with that just by saying things like, it's not healthy. Mommy or daddy doesn't want you to feel sick. Mommy or daddy doesn't want you to not be able to sleep because your tummy's bothering you tonight, or things like that. So I think that's not exactly what you asked about, but sometimes that can happen too. And I do think you have to put some limits in place for that, because that's just really, unhealthy.
And as long as we're talking about food, we're talking about what parents can do. One of the things that a foster parent can do is ask the child this age, what food do they like? What food did they eat growing up? And an example of this was a foster mom who asked, and the child said macaroni and cheese. And the mom had a wonderful family recipe for homemade macaroni and cheese baked in the oven. And she fixed it, and it was not at all what the child, wouldn't even touch it. And turned out that the child not only wanted the boxed macaroni and cheese, but they wanted a generic boxed macaroni and cheese, and they wanted it to be the instant type because that's what they were used to. And even though it killed this particular mom because she really didn't think it was all that healthy, and she didn't fix it every meal, but she started incorporating it, and so that child had something that seemed familiar to them, and as she continued to serve some healthy food along with it.
And that's one of the things that when I talk about losses that people don't necessarily have in the front of their mind is the loss of favorite foods, favorite recipes or favorite foods. And I think, we, as with your story, may have the assumption that when it comes to macaroni and cheese, of course, homemade is better, but being sensitive enough, as in the example you shared, to check that out with the child and to ask what were some favorite things and what were some favorite foods, because that's a loss too, in terms of, different families eat differently. And so if you're used to something else, it's hard, I think about when you, if you're staying at somebody else's house and you always have hot sauce on your eggs, and they don't even have hot sauce around or something like this. It's just little things, but they add up with feeling, out of place and not quite right, and, wishing you could have that favorite whatever that you can't have. So I think that's a great story of how a foster mom, took that sensitivity to find that out. It's not always what we would think. So it's good to ask.
No, it isn't. Another example of this was a foster family who was pretty darn good cooks, and their foster child was not liking anything, and they found out, I think through asking, he got a packet of ketchup. He started getting packets of ketchup from fast food places that they had gone to, and and then they saw that he was putting it on their food, so they sucked it up, bought him his own bottle of ketchup, and set it on the table. And he covered everything in ketchup because that's what he was used to. And so let's drop some of the value judgments, and we can introduce some healthy things. But if the child is going to feel better eating a lot of ketchup on everything, then take the long view. Will eventually, or he's going to reunify, and it really won't matter, because he's going to go back to eating ketchup. So let's make him feel better in the process. All right. So again, for this age, many of the same things: routine, age-appropriate discussion, sharing with the child, talking with the child, working with the school to understand why the child may be regressing in his grades. So working with the school, but I always say don't make school the primary focus at this point. The kid's going through enough. So try to just keep everything in perspective and try to help the school understand what the child is going through. Anything else that you can think of for school-age kiddos before we move on to our older kids?
The only other thing that I think can sometimes be helpful is maybe some books about loss or grief themes, and there's different ones out there. There are some some that aren't even necessarily made for children in a foster care situation. Just things like The Invisible String, or things like that, or books with themes of missing someone. But then there are some that are specifically, for children who might be going to a placement. One I like is called The Little Flower. And so I think what the books can allow is talking about some of these things in metaphor we're talking about a flower that something happened to them, and so they weren't being watered and fed, and not directly talking about the child's own experience, because the child may not be in a place to be able to do that. But if you can have books and stories with themes that might help the child. And I have found that parents are sometimes the best. I don't necessarily like to just give a list of books or something, because I think sometimes parents have good ideas about this too. So that was
and your librarian
I wanted to share. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And you don't have to buy all these books. The libraries are a wonderful resource. And you had mentioned before about the loss of cultural identity or culture and racial identity.
Mm-hmm.
So assuming that your foster child doesn't share your culture or your race, what are some things that foster parents can do to make that easier, make that transition easier, the transracial aspect easier for the child?
Well, I'm sure you have many ideas about this also, but I mean, I do think the first thing is educating yourself about, whether a culture your child's coming from, and some important things. I know when I worked with children in foster care, African American families would be very upset when for example, their hair wasn't well taken care of when they were with a white family, because they didn't have how to take care of it. So culture can be everything from, foods and celebrations and these kinds of things, all the way down to how someone takes care of their hair and different things like that. So I think the first thing is education yourself about some of that, so you can be aware of that and be sensitive to some of that, and maybe trying to orchestrate opportunities for the child to experience cultural experiences that are familiar to them, whether that's through taking them to a specific church or some other activity, or acknowledging a holiday and celebrating it. Because it was important in their culture and even in their family. We haven't really gotten much into celebrations and traditions as another lost thing, but if there's something that you can know and carry over, that I think that's very helpful.
Oh, yes, it's such a good point about that at the beginning, having talked about celebrations and traditions. A really good point. Just down to even how people celebrate birthdays and Yes. And boy, can that be something to bring up feelings for a child. A first birthday away from their family, very difficult thing that can trigger a lot of feelings of loss and sadness for the child. Even if the child's family didn't make a big deal out of the birthday, just knowing, in fact, that can often be off-putting if their foster family does celebrate big and their birth family does not. That even something you would think just the opposite, that the child would appreciate and enjoy the added sense of celebration, but that's adding a value judgment there, which says that my way is better, which in fact from a child's standpoint and from a reality standpoint may or may not be. Right.
Yes.
Now moving into the tween and teen years, let's say our 13 through 18, 19 even, I guess, depending on, probably not 19, but let's say through the teen years. Now these children understand, for the most part, what has happened. Do you see that the traditional stages of grief? I know there's some debate now in the psychological circles as to whether or not Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief are in fact the prescriptive as they once were. But her theory was that there are the different stages of grief, and most people work their way through them. They start with shock, and then they go into denial and anger. Or denial, and then anger and protest, and then bargaining. If with whomever, please God, I will do. If I do this, will you please let me get back? to my family, and depression, and then ultimately, and we hope for resolution. Do you see that this is it a useful model for foster parents to think of when they get a 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old?
Well, I'm going to say yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, because I think there are some of those stages that the child may go through, but I think that those stages, come out of some of the lost literature about death. And death is a very clear, final thing. I mean, we know that happened. This is when it happened. We know what happened right before it. We know what happened right after it. And so I do think that's different than, what we're sometimes talking about in the literature now, as you mentioned, that some people are having some different ideas about this, and that would be ambiguous loss. I think what's hard for children is, wait a minute, what am I grieving? Like, am I grieving the loss of my parents, or am I going back to my parents? What is the situation here in the child welfare and foster care system? They talk about doing concurrent planning. We're going to plan for the child to go home while we're also planning for the child not to go home. Well, I mean, that might be something that you can do on paper.
Yeah.
That doesn't work really well for the mind and heart of a child who's looking for stability and wanting to know what their future holds. And so that's why I think some of those stages can be helpful. And I think you may actually see some of those exact behaviors. But I also like to emphasize that it's much harder to work through grief when you're not exactly sure what's happening or what's going to happen.
That is such a good point. That is such a good point. The child, especially at this age, is old enough to understand that the goal, at least initially, is usually family reunification, and their parents are being asked to do certain things in order to make a safe place for the child to return back to. So, yeah, what are you grieving? Because, you can be of the belief that it's only going to be a short time, then my parents will get their act together and I will be home. Or, and then there's the whole issue of if my parents don't do this, then anger at your parents for not doing what's necessary to take care of you and get you back, and a feeling of betrayal. All of those are very real emotional responses to this. And I'm so glad you mentioned ambiguous loss, because talk about that. By the very definition of ambiguous loss is, I don't even know what I've lost, other than just, is it just temporary? Am I going back? If so, when? Will I be going back to live with my parents? Are my parents going to be changing, or is it going to be the same old? Yeah. So it's and these kiddos are old enough to understand it, or at least most of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as far as, some things for the older kids, I think journaling is really great. Not every kid will do that, but I recommend, have anymore it's so popular. You can just pick up a cute journal at the dollar store and encourage your child to be able to write about things. I think also, initiating some conversation about this, even if the child's not talking about it. And I think we alluded to this earlier, but don't assume that the child's not feeling these things because they're not talking about them. It's better to bring it up and open the doorway to talk about that. And if the child says, no, I don't want to talk about that, okay, that's okay. But they know that they have the space to talk about it. I recommend 20 Things You Wish Your Parents Knew by Sherry Eldridge about, issues that adopted children would like their parents to know, even though, and are feeling and thinking about, even though they're not talking about it. And so I think this is a time to open the door for expression of that, and offer to talk, offer to be available, listen. I think that one of the greatest times to talk with teenagers and have them really open up is in the car. There's something about sitting side by side, looking straight ahead, where kids just start chattering away in ways that they sometimes don't, if you just approach them at home. And I also think that music for adolescents can be a way of expression, and maybe talking to them about a favorite song that they're listening to right now. There's many popular songs out there about loss, transition, these kinds of things, and so even something related to that could open up a discussion of why they like that certain song or something like that. So I think that the ways we have to connect with these older kids are a little bit different.
I think I love the idea of music and asking why they particularly love a song can give you insight into. It could just be they like the beat or the transitions or whatever, but oftentimes it's especially if they're enjoying the music for the lyrics, it gives you an insight into what they're thinking and what they're experiencing. We should probably talk about, we overlooked it when we started on this, what grief and loss can look like in the tween and teen years. In some ways, it's not significantly different from what we saw at the elementary, but they're getting older, and so we will see some differences. So what are some of the things that we might see, behaviors that we might see that would be indicative of a child experiencing loss and grief?
So, as you mentioned, there's a lot of similarity, except these kids are bigger and stronger. So the acting out, whether it's, through anger or verbally, is going to be bigger and more powerful. And I really encourage, again, you kind of brought it up with the ketchup example, but pick your battles. If a child is not hurting anything and they're just letting off steam, maybe during this transition period, you're not going to have the same expectations as you would of a child that's been with you a longer period of time. And so if somebody's not, if nobody's getting hurt, that's the bottom line. We can't let anyone get physically hurt, and we certainly would hope that they're not getting emotionally hurt. But I think these kids can be argumentative. I think they can raise their voice at parents. I think they can be kind of withdrawn and sullen and not follow through on things around the house that they're expected to do. I think just having some grace for some of that, especially early in the placement, while at the same time having some structure and expectations, but just recognizing all that the child is dealing with, as we've been mentioning throughout this discussion.
Radical empathy. Understand.
Yeah.
Try to put yourself and it's it's very difficult to put yourself, because sometimes these situations are so painful to even put yourself in that. But to try to put yourself in this child's position, and then and I want to circle back to that. But before we do, one of the things that's difficult in the teen years is this is all happening at a time when developmentally the child is forming their own identity, trying to become independent, and this loss, this grief, this fear that's being introduced can really work a number on what is a normal developmental stage.
Mhm. Yes.
Yeah.
It really can.
And so that just it's fair to raise that. Then it is very difficult. I want to circle back to what we were talking about my term radical empathy. It's hard to do, and this is an example. We got a email actually from Renee, who says, "I have been surprised by the degree of loss my foster son feels. He was removed from a very abusive home. He would give anything to get back there. I'm at a loss as to why he feels this way and what to do. Renee is struggling with trying to understand. I think she probably wants to understand, but this child was in a very abusive place. So let's talk some about how children feel in abusive environments, and why would a child be wanting to get back to what was clearly an unhealthy place for him?
Well, I think the first thing is that it's familiar. It's what they know. It's what they're used to. I also think biological connections to our parents are very, very strong. We talked about earlier that, people say you look like them or you act like them or all of these things. So even I think it's important to not look at this in a dichotomy. Even when there's abuse or neglect, there can also be moments of connection and celebration and happy things. It's not not necessarily all one or the other. And even if it is more negative, as I just said, there's still that connection, that familiarity, and knowing what to expect and being in the bed that and the house that and being on the street that all of that, I think, is such a tremendous upheaval to just. Think about how discombobulated you feel traveling, staying in a hotel. Where surroundings are unfamiliar. You can't find your stuff, and this isn't quite right, and that's not quite right, and it just all feels like that. And I think. Really, to the point that you brought up earlier, is to not take it personally. I think foster parents are opening their hearts and their homes. They're doing, giving 110% to try to make, this better for a child. And sometimes it can feel like rejection of you. That how. I'm trying to do all of this, and you're talking about missing that, and it's so important to keep in mind that that's not a reflection of the care that you're giving, or anything about that. It's more about the loss of these other things that is what needs empathy and understanding. I think we go the wrong direction when we start to personalize that. And that's not helpful for the parent or the child, the foster parent or the foster child.
We have one last question, and that is from a foster mom, and it's long, so I'm going to paraphrase. There are required visits with the child's parents and grandparent, and she says that it was an 8-year-old. Her 8-year-old regresses significantly after every visit, and she wonders, it feels to her that the visits are bringing the loss up to the surface, up front and center again, and she is not sure she is going to be able to get the visits changed, but she was wondering what would be the disadvantages of trying to get the caseworker to reduce the visits with the family. There's a lot we don't know, let me add. She did not provide information about what the long-term plan is, whether the reunification is still the child's permanency plan, or if any of that's changing. She did not give any of that information, so we'll have to kind of answer it a bit in the dark. But I thought she raises a point that we certainly hear a lot, and that is that visits with birth family, sometimes it makes it feel like the children's behavior is regressing afterwards. So let's talk about that.
Okay. So I think it is important that you mentioned, what is the goal for this child, and if the goal is for the child to return home, we don't want to decrease contact with family. I think that the way, the first idea of this, I would not recommend be they get upset, so we have to stop these visits, or find a way to stop these visits, or decrease these visits. I find that people immediately go there and remain very stuck there. I think we ought to look at how can we help the child with the feelings that come up from these visits, rather than, let's reduce them. And like you said, there could be other details here that make this different. But I recommend having a plan in place for the child when they come back from visits. And having discussions with the child, especially a child of 8, you could do this. Wow, I know when you get home, you have a lot of big feelings, about whatever, whatever they're seeing, whatever symptoms they're seeing or behaviors they're seeing. And we want to think about, what would be helpful for you? Would it be helpful for you if we make sure we plan a quiet night at home the rest of the evening when you get home from a visit, playing a favorite game that you pick, or would it be helpful for us to go for a walk, or maybe you would like for us to just color together, and make a plan with a child about. I think the error in thinking is that we either want to not have the visits, or if they do have those problems, let's just not talk about why they have that. Well, we all know why they have those feelings and those behaviors. Sometimes I tell parents, say what you're thinking or talking to your spouse or whatever. Say that out loud to the child, that, gosh, this brings up lots of feelings about how much you miss your parents. That makes total sense. And look at how we can support the child in that. That's my recommendation. It's kind of a re-entry plan after visit that may, if the child's old enough, may collaboratively with the child. Mm-hmm. And if not, excellent. You making up what works well, for a littler one who can't be as participatory, but the kind of things that really calm them down and help them or make them feel safe and connected or whatever.
Excellent. Yes, I so totally agree. Thank you so much, Karen Buckwalter, for being with us today to talk about the losses inherent for foster children. Before we have talked some, but didn't quite get to a lot of the detail to talk about the losses that foster parents feel. So let's briefly touch on that because I think that so often we focus on our children, as foster parents will focus on the children, but it's hard to be a foster parent. It's hard to love and lose, and that happens. Let's talk some about the feelings of grief that foster parents have when their foster children reunify, even though they know going in that might be success, that might be the definition of success. It's still hard.
Yes. Well, the first thing that I would want to say is if you have overwhelming feelings of grief and loss, that means you really did your job right. Because as a foster parent, because I think that in some cases, foster parents, because they know that this may happen, that the child will leave, they keep their guard up. They keep a wall up. I've even had parents, foster parents, they say that, you have to call us Mr. and Mrs. Smith, because they're wanting to keep a very clear wall up that we can't get overly attached. We can't get overly connected. I even think in not that long ago, foster parents were even taught, don't get overly connected, don't get overly attached. We don't want the child to attach to you,
I hate that.
and this kind of thing. Yeah, and a child's attachment needs don't go on hold because they're with a foster parent.
Yeah.
Attachment's a reciprocal thing. So it's opening your heart to this child. And so I think sometimes foster parents think, I overly invested, or I did the wrong thing, or I shouldn't have gotten so attached. I disagree with that. I think that's what you needed to do for that season, for that child to feel safe and to feel connected and cherished and wanted. And I think that what we have to think about is how do you get support for those feelings? Who do you turn to? Do you turn to other foster parents? Do you turn, if you have a spouse, do you turn to your spouse? Do you turn to the agency or to your worker or family members, your small group at church? I think I would more so recommend, finding support for the pain of that, rather than saying, I'm just not going to get, attached or connected or take that approach. it's very, very hard. I mean, it's very sad and painful.
And you have the right, acknowledging it, and acknowledging that you have the right to feel the loss, and I loved how you said it, and the depth that you're feeling it is reflective of how good a job you did. So acknowledging it and bringing it to the fore, and there's also the loss, and for lack of a better way to say it, a loss of control. Not always, but in some cases, the foster parents may disagree with the decision, that whatever the decision has been made for the child, and that's hard, and that is a loss, and we may respond to that loss in different ways. And if we think back, it's not all that unlike how children respond to their loss. We could be angry, we could be depressed, we could any number of ways. We could express the fact that we didn't have control in a situation where we think that we should have had control, that we think we knew better, and that does happen. It doesn't always happen, of course, but I certainly hear, or we certainly hear at Creating a Family, from foster parents who are really struggling, and I think it's helpful to identify as a loss.
Yes. I think it is helpful to identify it as a loss. And I think some of what we have to also, I remember just even as a case, as a therapist in foster care, getting upset about certain decisions for children. So I'm getting upset, is it safe for them to return home? Is it okay for them to return home? And, just needing to remember it's minimum parenting standards. I think sometimes we get, but I could do so much more, and I could give so much more, like you talked about earlier with the birthday celebration. I think you have to remember that, just because they're not going back to what you have to offer at your house doesn't mean this is not the best decision for them to be with their biological family. I think that gets very mixed up for people.
It does.
And it makes it harder that there are some connections that a child has that supersede all of that, and one of them is remaining connected with a biological family or living with them if at all possible, and that need will trump those other ones. So I think it's important that's the other side of it, of in spite of the loss you feel, being able to support this decision for the child. So that's important too.
And for what foster parents can do, I think you summed it up beautifully. Acknowledge the loss as a loss and get support and you listed so many places. I think ideally getting support from other foster parents is wonderful, because these are people who have been there, done that. If you're fortunate enough to have an in-person support group, fantastic. If you don't, there are a number of online support groups, and the beauty there is they're available 24/7, and they're usually quite large, or at least the Creating a Family support group is quite large. So chances are very good, no matter what time of day you post, somebody who has gone through something very similar will be able to respond to you right then. So there are definitely there's support out there available online, but it also can just be people in your life, as you said, your small group at church, or your neighbor who has seen you daily going as a foster parent, your parents, your family, your husband, or your spouse, your partner. All of these people are people who can be there if you will let them.
Yes. Yeah. And you mentioned the ideal as other foster parents, and I so agree with that. And there's research, in the state of Illinois where I work, that the number one thing for adoptive and foster parents, the number one support, it's not the caseworkers or the educational classes you get ahead of time or any of that. It's talking to other foster and adoptive parents. That is the number one thing that helps people. So that we need to glad you drove that home.
I can't. We run a huge online support group, as I mentioned, the Creating a Family Facebook support group. It's a closed group, but I will tell you, it's a lot of work. But I so believe in the power of support. Peer support. I so believe in it. Creating a Family believes in it, and we invest in it. So anyway, now back to thanking you. Thank you, Karen Buckwalter, for being with us today to talk about this really important topic. Keep in mind that the information given in this interview. Oh, thanks. Keep in mind that the information given in this interview is general advice. To understand how it applies to your specific situation, you need to work with your foster professional or your adoption professional. Let me take a brief moment to remind everybody that this show could not and would not happen without the generous support of our partners who believe in our mission of education and support. One of those partners is Hopscotch Adoption. They are a Hague-accredited international adoption agency, placing children from Armenia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Georgia, Ghana, Guyana, Morocco, Pakistan, Serbia, Ukraine, and they also do kinship adoptions. So we thank them very much. Now, for everyone who wants to get more information about Karen, I've got some great news. She does a podcast. Attachment Theory in Action. That's the name of her podcast. And as you would imagine, around here we are big podcast, well, quite frankly, podcast addicts. So it's a great podcast, Attachment Theory in Action. You can also get her book, Attachment Theory in Action, Building Connections Between Children and Parents. That's available on Amazon. And if you want to check out the website where she hangs out, through Chaddock, it is traumaattachmentcenter.com. Trauma Attachment Center, all one word, .com. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will see you next week.